When we talk about growth, everybody says you need human capital, we need good education, we need skills, and if you read your newspapers, you frequently hear that industry people say that we are turning out students from universities, but the students are not sufficiently trained to be directly employable in Indian industry. The basic human resource material is actually quite good. And in fact, with a 3-4 month training program, they manage to do quite well. But they're not actually being given functional skills. Now, the worst example of that, of course, is our schools. Every year, you have the annual survey of education in rural India, the ASER survey. And that actually brings out that, 50% of the students in, let us say, class 4 or 5 cannot read a text which is meant to be read at class 2. So, if the educational system is non-performing to that extent, you can imagine what happens, that if 50% of the kids are not able to read the textbook, then essentially what is happening is, and they're being promoted automatically to higher and higher classes. So they keep going to higher and higher classes and progressively lose interest. Teachers also are not in a position to teach them properly. So the teachers just concentrate on the top 10% of the students. And so we are producing a very large number of students who don't have functional literacy and don't have functional numeracy. Now, in a world in which we are expecting to move labor from rural areas to urban areas, and I'll come separately to the technology trends, this is a huge challenge. Are we able to actually redeploy or restructure the education system so that it produces the kind of the people with the kind of skills that are now needed in order to produce jobs? And educational reform is extremely difficult. In the UPA times when I was in the Planning Commission, we concentrated on the Right to Education Act, etc. So there was a realization that this is very important, and more money was also spent. But the problem isn't more money. We did build the schools, so we did increase the enrollment rate. The enrollment rates in India in primary education are now high 90s. But the problem really is that half the kids are not actually learning what they should be learning. So this is a huge, huge challenge. And it's not a challenge that the central government can do anything about. This is entirely a state government matter. So here is an area where if we have these ambitions of high growth rate, we must have an answer on the schooling side. How are we going to take care of developing kids with the capacities needed to feed into the labor market? Now, let me touch on the third point which I talked about, and that's the whole question of what's happening to technology around the world and its impact on employment. I said in the beginning that in order to cope with this kind of structural change, we need to create a lot of non-agricultural employment because we have to take people off agriculture. But we're living in a world really where on the technology front, all the developments that are taking place are actually reducing the need for jobs in certain areas. Certainly in manufacturing, large manufacturing, labor intensity is going down and is being driven to some extent by technology. The impact of technology here is quite important because as you lock into global value chains, if you're a part of a global value chain, that will also dictate the technology you use. You won't be eligible for getting into that chain if you are not technologically up to the mark. And unfortunately, all the technologies that are being developed for the Western world, and they want to avoid hiring too many people. So this is the move away from labor employment in certain ranges of the technology. There are other technologies being developed which are actually going to make certain jobs irrelevant. This is not just an Indian phenomenon, this is true globally. I mean, I think many studies have been done in the United States which say that within 10 years, the numbers vary, but they say that 35% of the jobs that currently are there won't be needed. This is scaring a large number of people because it's what I call a structural change, but it's a bit of a shock also. Now, it's not that jobs will be destroyed. As historically has often happened, when new technology comes in, some jobs are destroyed, but then new jobs are created. I mean, the best example of that is, of course, all these Uber cars. Do you have Uber in Guwahati yet? Okay, you do. So, when Uber came in, I mean, the local taxis felt deeply threatened. Understand? Not just here, all over the world. On the other hand, the Uber technology allows a much more flexible work organization. People who only have 3 hours to spend at a job, particularly, for example, women who have other obligations that they don't want to give up, but they have 3-4 hours free, can become drivers of Uber cars and just switch off when they don't want to work. So a completely new kind of job has got created, and existing jobs are under threat. And you can multiply this in many, many areas. See, one of the issues here will be the initial reaction to these technology bringing in these new jobs will be anti. I mean, a good example of that is what happened with surge pricing in these Uber-type platforms. That is, when there's too much demand, the price goes up. From a purely economic point of view, that's not irrational. If the price for a ride goes up, many people who weren't offering their services come in, and when it's a low demand, they go out. So in a way, it serves the purpose of equating demand with supply. But there was a lot of objection to surge pricing because it was felt that it's exploitative. So people actually wanting the ride were saying, no, this is wrong, they shouldn't be allowed to raise the price, etc. So there's lack of full understanding, there are different points of view, but the bottom line is that I don't think it's going to be easy for us to be hitting 8% growth unless we are willing to make these structural changes. So, for example, in the case of jobs for young people, all over the world, and also I think in India, companies are no longer thinking of long-term hires. They hire people and then they let them go. This is what they call the gig economy. I never know how the word gig came up, but I'll find out. Now, one view is in the West that this just allows flexibility. You can move into the labor market, move out of the labor market, etc. But many other people have rightly pointed out it creates an enormous amount of insecurity. Because you cannot now say that I have a job with a high probability that you're going to be permanently employed. Then you can start planning your life and, taking a loan to buy a house or buy a car or something like that. And in the West, this shift is causing social tension. Of course, the answer people say is that, look, if this is the way we're going to go, then the state must put some social security floor under everybody, and they haven't done that yet. So we need to look at how our society is going to change with this sort of new approach to employment, and what is it that we can do given our own limitations. So I think this is another example where we have to recognize that the old solutions aren't going to work. We have to find some new solutions that will address these problems. And yet another example is all the kind of online purchases that take place. Banks, I mean, the rise of online transactions really means that you don't have to visit your bank very often. In our case, we have public sector banks that are hopelessly overstaffed. I mean, the difference in, if you like, per 100 rupees or 100,000 rupees of transaction, public sector banks have 4 times as many employees as private sector banks do. So my point is that, if banks are going to be forced to become more efficient, they have to be, then basically they may not fire anybody for quite some time, but they won't be hiring people either because they have excess staff, except in very specialized areas. So we'll see the effect of that in the next 10 years in much less growth of employment in the traditional areas which were the sources of white-collar employment. That's already happened in the case of the public sector for quite some time, probably likely to happen in the case of banks also. So we need to look at what are the new jobs that are being created. And that's where all over the world, and in India too, a lot of emphasis is being placed on startups, encouraging young people to start their own business. And a lot of that is actually happening. But one of the things with a startup is that while it also hires people, it doesn't hire them on a long-term basis. It also hires them on a much more short-term basis. So everybody has to get used to the fact that new jobs are being created, but they're going to be very different jobs from the ones that our people have been traditionally used to. So that is something that requires some adjustment. If the answer lies in many, many more startups, then we have to look at what is the ecology that will encourage and support startups. And the biggest thing there is ease of doing business, simplicity. People can come in and walk out of the business. They should be able to close a business without too many problems, etc., etc. But the rules and the laws that we have got do not allow people to close businesses very easily. And what this will do is it will discourage new startups from coming. So, which means that while some jobs are being lost, not enough new jobs are being created. So this is another area where we need to have a very focused attention.